This is Fat to Fierce. Welcome to the Confidence Chronicles. I'm your host, Amy English. Join me on this empowering adventure towards a healthier relationship with food, body, and self, one delicious bite at a time. Hello there. Welcome to Fat to Fierce. I am so excited you're here today. So in today's episode, I'm going to share a story. It's one of my favorites. It's the story of my last binge eat. And the reason I want to share this story with you, the reason I believe this story is so important is because I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened on the day of my last binge. Because there's a lot of takeaways on things, activities that can be very helpful if you're looking to change your eating habits, but specifically change your habit of binge eating. Now, before I share the story, yes, this was my very last binge. This was my very last out of control binge eat. This does not mean it was the last time I overate or the last time I had an emotional eat. If you listened to episode 8, I went through the difference between each of those eating habits. This story is specifically about my last binge eat. And yeah, it's just real important to, to clarify that, because here's the other piece of this. So my last binge eat happened in April of 2017. And I remember that clearly because I remember exactly what was going on in my life, in our lives at that time, my family. And it was a highly stressful time, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But the reason that it's important for me to share this story, let me take just a step back for a second here. So one of the things that I often mention to my clients, so when a client begins working with me, when someone signs up for private coaching, it's a 6-month private coaching program. We work together for 6 months every single week. We meet once a week, 26 weeks, 26 sessions. And most of the time when my clients come to work with me, they're struggling with overeating, emotional eating, and often binge eating. Now, not always. Sometimes my client has already overcome binge eating, but still struggling with overeating and emotional eating. But for the ones who are still struggling with binge eating, they seem to think that once they've signed up for coaching, that means they're not supposed to have a binge. This comes from diet mentality, okay? When you start the diet, you're supposed to be quote unquote good. You're not supposed to overeat or go off plan or fall off the rails. So my guess is that this is where that logic comes from. You sign up for coaching, you're going to work with an emotional eating coach. You can't have a binge. But what I love to remind them, and this is going to sound perhaps a little bizarre to some people, what I like to remind them is that your next binge is the best thing that can happen. The sooner it happens and are working together, the better. Here's why. There is so much information in a binge. When you're working to overcome binge eating, it is key, it is critical to understand the reasons we turn to food, the reasons we binge eat. It is important to start connecting those dots to understand what triggered, what caused the binge. It's about looking at what was happening at the moment before the binge, during the binge, and after the binge. because that's where we can gather all the good information and really start to understand the habit of binge eating. Now, I know that's, it's hard because I know for myself that, binge eating was embarrassing for me. I held a lot of shame about my habit of binge eating. And I think that's one of the reasons why I share so many of my stories about binge eating. And I'll be sharing a lot of the stories on this podcast as we, continue on this journey together. And that's because I want to bring light to it, because I promise you, you are not the only one. I mean, I have stories of myself. I have stories that my clients have, given me permission to share anonymously. But there are so many stories. There are people who struggle with binge eating. And the more we can bring this to light, the more people know they're not alone, the more people can get help and the less suffering in silence. So back to my story. Okay. So I'm just going to dive in and kind of walk you through what was going on, because this is where we want to just gather the information. So let's travel back in time, shall we? Let's travel back to April of 2017. What was happening at this time, we had just moved. We had just moved from New York to Georgia. And it was a very stressful time for my family. Moving across the country is a big deal. And so on this particular day, I mean, we had been in Georgia for a few months at this point, but my husband was dealing with some work stuff and he had been at the office a lot. My kids were both in school. They were in elementary school at the time. We've been in Georgia for several years, but at the time they were young, and everybody seemed to have their days in order. They seemed to have, my husband was working, the kids were at school, and here I was at home starting my coaching business, working from home. And it was lonely. And I was terribly homesick. I had a very hard time when we first moved to Georgia. Heck, the first year or two were rough. I wanted to move back so many times. And on this one particular day, it was having an especially difficult time. Just feeling sad and stressed. It was kind of like our world had turned upside down. And my husband was dealing with some major problems at work that were keeping him there like for hours, like day and night. And there was this one particular day that I decided to make the kids chocolate chip cookies. So while they were at school, I made chocolate chip cookies for them. And as I was taking the chocolate chip cookies out of the oven and putting them on the cooling rack, I started eating them. And then before I knew it, I was shoveling chocolate chip cookies in my face, standing at the counter, stuffing one after the other into my mouth. And it was so fast. I was at such a feverish, fast pace. I remember, I mean, I can still see it in my mind when I think about it and when I talk about it. I was eating the cookies so fast. I don't even know that I mean, I must have taken a minute to breathe, but it didn't seem like it at the time. And I probably ate about a dozen of those cookies. And when I finished eating the cookies, I immediately started thinking, oh my goodness, what have I done? But now keep in mind, I was already well on my path to healing my relationship with food and overcoming all the habits, right? But of course, that thought was going to come in my mind. What have you done? Oh my goodness, look at what you did. You shouldn't have done this. But I gently redirected my brain. And I said, hold on a second. before we start to beat me up, let's figure out what happened. So now this was new, right? This is something different. So I grabbed a notebook and my pen and I went and I sat down and I just asked the question, what happened? What led to me feverishly stuffing about a dozen cookies in my mouth in like minutes? And as I started writing, and let me just take a step back for a second. Learning to overcome your habits with food really does take some honesty. You got to be honest with yourself. You got to be honest with yourself and what was happening in the moment and be willing to face the feelings and what's, what you're thinking in those moments. And so as I started writing what was happening in the moment, and I wasn't editing myself, I was just writing whatever was coming up for me in the moment, I started to see a pattern. And I began noticing, so I was feeling sad. I was feeling homesick. I was feeling stressed. I was feeling like our world had just turned upside down. And I was feeling out of control. And this struck me, this feeling of being out of control, being out of my element, not knowing what's going on around me, not feeling like I have a grip on a situation, and just feeling like everything's kind of spinning out of control as it felt in that particular moment in time. And what I realized, this was a huge aha, okay? What I realized, and before I say this, it might not make sense at first. So I'm going to just invite you to sit with it for just a second, okay? Because what I realized on that day at this moment when I was journaling is that my out of control eating made me feel in control of something. And I know that sounds really strange, but oh, did it resonate in the moment when I could sit there and realize that, oh, this old familiar pattern of binge eating, of feverishly stuffing food in my face, was enough of something that I could grasp onto that helped me feel like I had some control in an out of control time, in a time when I felt like I was out of control. I still remember writing the words on the paper, and I still have that journal, and every once in a while I go back and read it, and it is like, oof, that was such an important nugget of information for me to realize. This was the kind of awareness. This is the kind of awareness I often talk about. It's the kind of awareness that doesn't go away. Like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so for me, what I saw in that moment was a very old pattern I had with food and eating that helped me feel like I had some sort of control. And I remember sitting in the chair with my notebook, feeling very full, feeling very stuffed and a little sick to my stomach from eating so many chocolate chip cookies, and just thinking to myself, I think I just unlocked something here. I think I just unlocked a key component of my habits with food. And I did, because that day was the last time I had a binge like that. I have not binged since. And it still blows my mind, almost 7 years later at the time of this recording, that I was able to resolve this habit that I had for so long that I just figured I was going to have to live with for the rest of my life. it changed everything. My willingness to be vulnerable with myself and to explore what was happening in my world before I started eating the cookies, while I was eating the cookies, because that's when I was like, oh, that feverish pace of eating so fast, of like, even though it was out of control, somehow it felt in control. Maybe because I was choosing it, although I wasn't consciously choosing it, if you know what I mean. And then afterwards, being able to retrace those steps. This is something I call being the private investigator, becoming your own private investigator and documenting all of the steps, all of the events that took place leading up to and during and after the binge. Because when you can do that, when you can sit and capture that information, and it's just the facts, right? Just the facts. I always date myself when I talk about Dragnet. Who remembers that show? Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. You want to be your own private investigator. Put in the facts and see what dots you can start to connect. And I love, love, love doing this with my clients during session. Walking through, in fact, just last week, one of my clients, we did this. We walked through exactly what was happening, what had happened before, during, and after her binge. And the little nuggets, the little takeaways are, I can't put into words how important it is to see for yourself, because that's the awareness that changes everything. And so, yes, when my clients start working with me, I will tell them, don't expect not to have an emotional eat or not to binge eat. And goodness, when you do, please bring it to session, because we're going to walk through what happened. You're going to be your own private investigator, and we're going to find all the nuggets, because that's the information, that's the awareness that's going to help you change the habit for good. All right. I hope this is helpful. And if you're struggling with food, with binge eating, with emotional eating, with overeating, please know you're not alone. And always feel free to reach out for support, schedule a discovery call, or check out the website and get the Fat to Fierce program. I hope you have a great day. Are you ready to take control of your eating, embrace your body, and boost your confidence? Then let's get fierce. Start your Fat to Fierce journey today. Go to amyenglishcc.com for more resources and to book your discovery call.